Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit about what I worked on since the last recording. So in the last recording, I think I was looking at this ArcShell server load alerting script. And basically, I showed how we can, set up two thresholds which have to be exceeded for a given number of minutes before an alert is opened. And the new function that was written there is timer minutes true. And again, just real briefly, we pass in an expression that's going to evaluate to true or false, and a key so that it knows how to track that expression, and it will take care of tracking the amount of time and returning the number of minutes that's been true or false. So we have these variables, and you can get variable overload very quickly, because when you write code, a lot of times you want to basically give control to the user for a lot of things, or eventually they'll ask for control, and they need variables to do that. So configuration is a big part of every tool that you will write ever. So these are all the variables. This is the documentation, and this gets output automatically when the product is built to a schedules file, and everything that's scheduled will have the name and then some documentation. It's just marked down. So I've put all the variables in here that you can control this with. So you have your thresholds, they all have defaults, so you're not going to see these variables defined in any config files. If you want to configure anything different, you need to put them in a config file, and what I'm going to show you is how you can create your own config files at this point. And we have a variable here to disable it entirely, so maybe you just want to disable it. This is a truthy value, and I've said many times in other videos, but truthy values are expressions that kind of evaluate to true, yes, no, true, false, these kinds of things. But more importantly, you can use cron expressions. So I can disable this particular script on the weekends just by setting disable server loading in one of the config files. So we are in the ArcShell home. This is the schedules folder, and we're in 01M, which is every minute. That is controlled by this file, this schedule.config, and that controls when this runs. And what happens is every minute, basically, the daemon comes through and checks to see if that evaluates to true or not. And if it does, it runs it. And we can disable everything in this. We can disable this entire schedule here. Again, that's a truthy value. You could use a cron expression there. Okay, so if we wanted to change the, and I also did a little work on this collect server load stats, so that we've got that in two scripts now. It runs every minute. This is collecting the server load stats, and we have a disable variable there. But let's say we want to set this up. We want to set the threshold up differently on a dev environment. So if I go into ArcShell, global config ArcShell, and so global is your directory that gets pushed out to all your servers. So the idea here is we're on a single node. We are managing our ArcShell installation. We're updating it. We're writing scripts, and then we're pushing this entire folder structure out to all of our other nodes. And those nodes are our SSH connections out here. And so this is the folder that our global SSH connections will be defined in. And in those connections are your tags. So you can associate tags with your servers. And so this is the main ArcShell config file that gets loaded. Now there's three homes. Essentially there's the regular home, so you have ArcShell config, and then you'll have global config, and you'll have user config. User config is not going to get pushed or loaded on every server. It's only going to get loaded on the server that it belongs on. So but global gets pushed around. These files are meant to be pushed around. So here's our ArcShell config, which is loaded anytime we load ArcShell. Setup config is only loaded during setup. Sometimes there's some variables we need during setup. We put them in setup config. And then you can add as many other .cfg files as you want, and they'll get loaded dynamically after ArcShell is loaded. So I've created one called dev.config. And this is what we're getting to, is what we're going to do here is, at this point, ArcShell is fully available when this gets loaded. So we're saying if not tag match dev, then return. And so if this is a dev server, if the server has dev in it, we can override some, or we can set some of these values explicitly. So I'm setting the critical OS load alert type to warning instead of critical. The default would be critical. So on a dev machine, I don't want to even have necessarily a critical alert. And I'm setting the abnormal OS load minutes to 300. I think it defaults to 120. So we are going with 300 there. And that will get loaded dynamically. Let me show you how that happens. We're getting into the nitty-gritty details. Let's close that and close that. We'll go to shell, and we have ArcShell core. So when we load ArcShell, ArcShell core ultimately gets run. It loads up all of our libraries. See how it's sourcing them in, and we get down to the bottom. And what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all the .cfg files that aren't arcshell.config or setup.config and load them. And we'll do that for the global home first and then the user home. So that's all that happens there. So that makes it possible for you to create your own custom config files for different environments. You could do this all in one file. You don't have to have dev. You could say, you know, if tag has dev, then do this. If prod, do this. But it allows you to basically configure, have very flexible configuration for how you want to set up your configuration. And you're managing this all from one environment, which makes it really easy. So that is what we've been working on, and not sure what I'm going to tackle next this morning, but I'll let you know once I get it done. All right, thanks.